It's a great pleasure being with you with all this great energy. And actually quite inspired by Brian earlier. We try to get you to an appropriate level of intellectual arousal to get to the point that we have some energy and intellectual stimulation. So we really want to tell you a story of how we accidentally yet somehow innovatively met, and how we believe that this is a kind of illustration of how communities have the power to accelerate serendipity.
Over the last 2 decades in particular, the rapid evolution and progress in technology and ideas has resulted in a particular type of community development, a frequency of events and of a congregation of people that we haven't seen before, beyond which our parents' generation could ever have imagined.
And before we really dive into it, we'd like to briefly kick it off with introducing ourselves. This is John. John is Irish, which basically means that we'll probably only understand 20% of what he says, but it will for sure sound marvelous.
Yeah, so I'm Irish and Chris is German, and that's meant that for the last week, I've heard more, "Don't worry, John, if you make a mistake, I'll bail you out" jokes than you could believe. So Chris is a recent PhD and associate director at the Innovation Labs at LSE, and we're going to tell you guys a story about how we met at the Sandbox Global Summit in Lisbon in 2012, how a couple of serendipitous events resulted in us being here today. So Chris started out as a young student at LSE, where he met Severin on the board, on the slide as you see at the minute, and Severin introduced him to Antoine, Nico, and Fabian. And these 5 guys became the original founders of Sandbox, an organization that was originally started with the idea of a conference event for millennials, to identify young visionary leaders and bring them together to one conference, but evolved over time and circumstance to become something much more pervasive and much more significant. And is what is now the world's foremost global community of exceptional young leaders under the age of 30 around the world from a multitude of different fields, numbering over 1,000 people in over 80 countries.
And by the time we met in Lisbon, John has had his own journey. So he was in Dublin at his alma mater, and he was giving a talk about something completely unrelated. And Neve Hughes, our ambassador at that time in New York, she was talking a bit about Sandbox and about her excitement for it. And John got aroused about it and got excited about it. And he was like, shoot, I should really get involved there.
My fiance's involved there.
Yeah, she's watching. So he got really excited about it. And then he got into this whole idea of community. And he got introduced by Neve to Will and Tia, who at that time were our ambassadors in London. And from that on, he had a lot of kind of random occurrences that somehow led him in the end to become ambassador, first in Dublin, and in the end then the CEO of Sandbox.
Yeah, so this one coincidental event. I said yes to this event in my old university, said I'd go along with it to do a favor, and I met Neve at it. And through meeting Neve, my whole life changed. That's a very, very monumental moment in anyone's life. And to be honest, with Sandbox, with this community that's now a massive and significant part of who I am, I found it at a particular time in my life when I didn't know I was looking for it, but I certainly needed it. And everybody feels like that at some point in their life. At that point where you feel like somewhat of a misfit, you don't fit in, that you're looking for something, and you feel like you have to compromise who you are and how you express yourself just to identify with those around you. If you think about it, the group you're in here, a very, very specific community, whether you're from Cambridge or Oxford or wherever else, took a lot of work to get here. Did you feel like you were coming home when you landed here? Because that's certainly how I felt when I found Sandbox for the first time. A community of individuals who wanted me and were pushing me to be all that I could be, how I wanted to portray that, how I wanted to express myself. What I'm talking about is the idea of serendipity. What I'm talking about is one unplanned event and how the monumental impact it had on my life.
Imagine if we could recreate situations where we would experience this serendipity on speed in a way, where positive coincidences would happen much more often, and where we much more often in different fields would have the occasion of, wow, this is random, but this is really magical, and this is really something that changes my life forever.
Take a second, just think about it. Everybody has one of those moments where it was unplanned and unexpected, and despite all of the work, all of the study, all of the training, all of the effort, all of the people you knew, something happens. Somebody you met, somebody you wandered into, a set of events, something happened which changed everything. Maybe it became something that defined who you are, but it certainly changed the trajectory of your life. The idea of a positive, unplanned, unexpected event is a powerful sentiment. It's a magical moment that happens in our lives only a few times. We don't forget them.
Imagine it in your professional life when it comes to career, in your social life when it comes to friends, in your inspirational life when it comes to ideas, or when it comes to meeting the love of your life, which randomly you meet at a 3 o'clock at night fire alarm when you all jump outside and somehow run into each other.
We're not trying to suggest that tea and consumer.
No, they are not a couple. Yeah,
okay, so
all right. Well,
just to clarify in case you see this. So that leads us on to what we're going to speak about today. What we're going to talk to you guys about is how to build communities that accelerate the rate of serendipity in society, business, and governance. All our lives, and as we mentioned a number of times today, we have seen communities everywhere, whether it's in the digital space, whether it's the mechanism we use for change, the mechanism we use for associating with each other, the mechanisms we use for expressing civil liberties, the mechanisms that we use to actually identify ourselves, associate with others, and sometimes they even exist in direct opposition to each other. Sometimes one can't exist without the other. And that's what's changed. That's what technology has done. That's what this rapid evolution of ideas has done. Because what we've seen now are types of communities existing and developing that no longer require geography and national borders just to associate with each other. Through things as simple as Facebook or a WhatsApp group, we can develop very interactional communities that become extremely meaningful, intimate and loyal, but at the same time transient.
So from our work at Sandbox and at the LSE and looking at other communities, including TEDx and R-Labs and others, we figured that there seem to be 6 patterns that somehow go through all these communities, that somehow make them effective. You can call them mobile societies, you can call them digital nations, you can call them borderless, whatever it is. But it is about sharing ideas, it is about sharing certain interests and passions. And so these 6 are really creating parameters based on shared values, identifying and empowering local ambassadors, facilitating decentralized connectivity, engendering lateral accountability, facilitating homogeneous experiences but not homogeneous groups, and being exclusive, not elitist. And so when it comes to creating parameters based on shared values, it's one of the things we found to be most existential for communities. When you think about communities in the past, as John just talked about, we see it's a lot about ethnicity, it's a lot about the kind of all the things you can't pick, right? Ethnicity and geography and whatever it is. Versus nowadays we see communities emerging that are more based on interests, on shared values, on ambition. And what we see there is that if you see these alineations of how actually shared values can be established via application processes or via shared rituals, what you see here is the Sandbox hug, which is basically the idea that when you see sandboxers and they want to share this idea of respect and reciprocity, the first thing, even if they don't know each other, they hug each other. And so the idea is really to embody values and to say, okay, well, look, how can we create communities that somehow are not in the sense transient, they are transient in the sense of time and geography, but they're not transient when it comes to values and shared passions. So it's very different from the kind of malicious intents you see when it comes to more over-individualized attempts.
So rule 2, guys, is that we identify and empower ambassadors. And what we mean by identifying and empowering ambassadors is that we celebrate our champions, our heroes. The values of your organization should be expressed not through the brand of the organization nor the administration, but it should be expressed through the people who best represent you. Because communities exist for the individual members. They're all trying to accomplish something, and community is the best mechanism to get there. So identify those ones who you most associate with and build around them, not the organization itself. By building around the organization, we limit the capacity of the actual members to accomplish their individual goals.
And one of the aspects we're most excited about is actually the whole idea of decentralized connectivity. So how you, the first time in history, have the power to connect offline and online, to say we have local communities, local events, local TEDx events, and then we have global platforms, global social media channels that actually bring local and global together, and that are not in opposition to each other, but rather that complement each other. So when you think about, so this is TEDx Volcano. So TEDx Volcano was an event in London where basically you might remember this volcano breaking out a few years ago where there was this huge ash cloud over London. And so some people took the boat, others decided to not take it and to rather wait in London. And at that time there was the Skoll World Forum in Oxford. So all of these amazing people coming from all over the world to the Scholar World Forum and to other events that happened at the same time, they were all stuck in London. And they all had their meetings cancelled, so they all didn't know what to do. They were all sitting there, all these executives who were so dependent on their meeting schedules, and they were like, what do I actually do now? And so basically, Nathaniel Whittemore, a sandboxer who's usually based in San Francisco, he was like, well, let's set up a conference. So what he did was, within 30 hours, he organized a full-fledged TEDx conference with over 8,000 people on the recorded live stream, hundreds of people on the guest lists. I mean, it was completely sold out, with people like Jeff Skoll speaking, and with having everything without having any real physical contacts before in London. So how did he do that? Well, what he did was he leveraged global communities, offline, online, on both sides. So what he did was he leveraged the brand of TED, of some communities like Sandbox and the Hub, and then he kind of got access to these local resources, like the Hub spaces, like Sandbox volunteers, and so on. So he was able to combine these two and to very powerfully show how this is actually possible to take action in a very short time period nowadays, when you don't have what we see in a lot of governments, where you have consolidated influence, which takes very long to actually take place and to actually get action.
I'll be honest, the first time I heard of TEDx Volcano, I thought it was a TEDx in a volcano. I got very excited. So rule number 4 is engendering lateral accountability. What does that mean? Great communities have this thing where members accept responsibility for other members. So when you become a member of the community, you understand that the way you behave affects other people, that you have a responsibility to conduct yourself in a certain way to make sure that you represent other people well as well, the other members of your community, and the negative or positive behavior that you exhibit publicly will affect those individuals. Particularly when you've got global communities like Sandbox, where we have hubs and bases and members in areas of the world that aren't necessarily as liberal as here. And things that may be seen as socially acceptable here can put people in a very precarious position in other parts of the world. It was only about 5 months ago where a girl in Syria got stoned to death for opening a Facebook page. So what happens if somebody in our New York base or our London base or our Toronto base or our Berlin base does something which may not be seen as publicly acceptable in that part of the world? Responsibility and making sure we have measures to enforce accountability are paramount. That is completely different, though, from what we've seen from some of the biggest companies in the world over the last number of years, where we have seen a lack of an ability to enforce accountability across the organization, and that's resulted in massive institutions failing, whole industries collapsing, and all of us suffering some sort of consequence because of the acts of individuals.
And what we see building on this kind of peer-to-peer accountability, this accountability to each other, we also want to create homogeneous experiences where we say, well, around the world, ideally, like what you see here is a Sandbox dinner, where a Sandbox dinner in Dublin should feel very similar to a Sandbox dinner in Nairobi. It's cool people meeting up, being humble about it, not bragging about what they're doing, but rather kind of really diving deep into their fears, their challenges, all things they want to do. Or when you go to a TEDx event, you can usually be reasonably sure that people usually talk for 18 minutes. You can be reasonably sure that the speakers are okay, and so on. So you have a homogeneous experience, yet you don't have, ideally, a homogeneous community. This only 80, 90 years ago in the US was still kind of posters that were hanging around that were socially accepted. The idea that you could actually create communities based on their background, on their ethnicity. You basically define communities by which people you would exclude versus by which people you would include. And we now get to the point where we say we create communities that are diverse, that allow for diverse ideas, but that are homogeneous when it comes to experiences and when it comes to real deep values.
So rule 6 is communities need to be exclusive. Now, at first impression, this may seem a little bit controversial, but think about it. Communities are actually defined by their exclusivity. Think about a geographic community. That geographic base, you're a citizen if you live within the borders of that base, not if you live outside the borders of that base. It's the same with all communities. You establish what the parameters are. They may be physical, they may not be. At Sandbox, what we identify are these exceptional young people who are very, very high character. They could be best-selling authors, they could be successful entrepreneurs or artists or scientists or academics or adventurers. But we look for particular types of people, and they become our notional boundaries. Communities need to be exclusive, but they can't be elitist. Elitist communities are the ones that base themselves on those traditional values, those hierarchical values of geography, of ethnicity, of heritage, things that are inherent, but things that are no longer merit-based. So what we tried to talk to you guys about today was this idea of serendipity and how communities can be used as a mechanism to accelerate it. So what this slide shows is that me operating independently, the likelihood of me coming into contact with Chris is very slim. My sphere of influence and his sphere of influence, even if we've similar interests, aren't going to intersect with each other at any point unless we deliberately seek each other out, and that's not serendipitous. But what we see is when we encounter a community-based environment, I have people who are advocating on my behalf, people who understand my objectives and my goals and see my success as their success because they feel ownership of the community. They will advocate on my behalf, and the likelihood of a fortuitous event happening in your life increases significantly. And just to go back to where we started, one event that I volunteered to go to a number of years ago, one serendipitous moment, one serendipitous encounter, ended up with me becoming a member of Sandbox, an ambassador of Sandbox, CEO of Sandbox, and leading me to the point where I'm standing on this stage with Chris speaking to you. And it would never have happened if I hadn't put myself in the way of that event. It would never have happened if I didn't have all these people around me to advocate on my behalf. And now all of you guys are involved in that moment. That one moment that happened years ago, a magical moment in my life, you guys are all now part of. And everything that you do afterwards will be affected in some way by that. That's what serendipity is all about. Whether or not we change the trajectory of your lives today through this talk is up to you guys to define. But some of you will, some of you won't. Some of you guys will walk out and forget about it. But some people here are going to do something afterwards. Some of you guys are going to apply to Sandbox as a result of this. Some of you guys are going to try and set up a community as a result of this. Some of you guys who are already managing communities will change the way you address it as a result of that. And this will have massive ramifications over the rest of your life. That's what we want to talk to you guys about today, how building communities effectively are actually a mechanism to accelerate serendipity in our lives.
And so to sum it up, basically, we said we believe that we can accelerate serendipity by, as you saw with John's examples, putting yourself into the right environment where unexpected experiences can happen, being that diverse conferences, being that diverse events, communities, connecting with multipliers or filters that enable access to these serendipitous environments and that enable to spread this and to basically link up to all these other people, to increase the visibility to the people that somehow matter in terms of actually spreading that information or spreading the kind of ideas and so on, and then being open-minded enough, and that comes to Brian's talk in the morning, being open-minded enough to actually take these opportunities and actually doing something with it. And so what we actually then see is that if we think about this, what we talked about, that we talked about who we are, how we are here, how communities like Sandbox can accelerate serendipity, and then how we actually believe that if you think about kind of these ideas that you can't connect the dots looking forward, but only looking backwards, so you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. We agree with this. But what we disagree with is that you cannot influence how these dots actually will connect, and that you can put yourself into environments where the dots might get into more positive environments, where in the case of John, for example, his best friends now are actually coming out of these experiences and so on. So basically, the different parameters of life shifted in a way. So the next time when someone comes to you and tells you it was just luck, it was just chance, look them very deeply into the eyes and send them the link to our talk. Thank you.